Hey there. Well, it's been a while, but we're finally back, and we're going to geek out this time. I want to say this week, but I'm hesitant to do so because this is not a weekly thing. But we're going to talk about the Nissan GTR this time. And this isn't going to be like the previous geek out videos because this car has been out for so long that if you are interested in this car at all, you probably know everything you want to know about this car. So I'm not going to go over every specific point. What I want to talk about is my suspicions and theories about why this car works as well as it does and the things that make it interesting to me personally. And we start back in 2009, 2008, when the GTR won Motor Trend's Car of the Year award. This was actually my first year at Motor Trend, and I got to see the GTR win Car of the Year, which is a huge thing. Car of the Year is certainly the longest running award in the business, and to see the process of how it happens, how the award is chosen, all the grueling testing that's happening, all the debates and the analyzing that goes into the data and the subjective feedback and all that stuff, and actually seeing a bunch of industry experts call this car the Car of the Year was a truly fascinating thing. It's almost a parallel. There were some similarities between when this car won Car of the Year and when the Tesla Model S won Car of the Year last year, 2 years ago, in that both cars represented a shock to the industry, a new way of thought, a new way of doing things that genuinely surprised us. And they both, not only did they do things differently, but they did things differently and they did those things well too, which, sometimes doesn't always happen. It was fascinating to see the experts get out of this car back then and just be completely blown away by what it accomplished and how well it does the things it does. It was really cool to see that and be a part of that. And going on now, 8 years later, to see how the GTR is today, it remains a really, really cool thing. This is there's not sports cars like this. This is different in many ways and totally interesting because of how different it is. Here's the layout of the car. Now, there's a lot to go over, so we have to just basically start in pieces. But the part that I respect and really admire about this car is that it seems to be, in my mind, there's a clear plan for this car, and they say, it's the supercar of the sports cars for any time, anywhere, any road, whatever. It's the do everything car. It's simultaneously a supercar. It's simultaneously a commuter. It has to do everything. It has to be daily drivable, but you also have to be able to take it to a racetrack, and that demands a lot of accomplishments. If you're going to drive it every day, you have to worry about all-weather tractability, so it's going to be all-wheel drive. You have to worry about comfort, too, so there's got to be some comfort trimmings to go along with that. But also it needs to compete with, on the outset back when, their main competitor, they weren't coy about it, was the 911 Turbo. And that's a pretty high bar to set when you're working with a GTR. But they accomplished all that stuff. And, the original GTRs, the R32, R33, R34, and there were GTRs before that, but of course the ones that comes to everybody's mind are the R32 through R34 GTRs. Those were hot-rodded Skylines. They took the Skyline chassis and they put a big motor in it, they put all-wheel drive in it, they made it go faster. This GTR is a completely different animal. It doesn't share an architecture with anything else. Everything is, not everything, but most of this car is bespoke to this car, and that really gives it a lot of advantages where they can set targets for the car, really crazy targets, and accomplish that when they can just build everything specifically for this car. So here's the general outset of the car, the general way the way the platform looks, and the real interesting parts tend to happen right in the center, but we'll get to that later. The cutaways are really cool. See how all the packaging works. There's a lot of stuff in this car, and it is a heavy car, but it works in spite of that. Now, of course, at the very beginning, at the very front, we have a twin-turbo V6, 3.8 liter. The code is, there's a lot of just codes in this car that are absolute hell, so I had to write them all down. I wrote this one down, didn't I? Oh, God, please tell me I wrote this one down. VR VH38RDD. It's a nightmare to remember. I forget the actual code. Oh yeah, VR38DETT. There you go. I did write it down. I just missed it in the notes. 3.8 liter twin turbo V6, all aluminum, dual overhead cams, 4 valves per cylinder, variable intake timing, variable intake valves, not on the exhaust side, only on the intake side. Still port injection. The oil pan is a combination between a dry sump and a wet sump. There's some interesting stuff happening there. And it's changed quite a bit throughout the generations. When it started, it made, 480 horsepower back in 2009 and 430 pound-feet of torque. And then now the Nismo today does 600 horsepower and 481 pound-feet of torque. That's quite a jump in those power figures. That's really cool to see how that's grown. It's grown. The basic core of the engines remain largely the same. They've just changed intake, exhaust, changed turbos, changed fuel mapping and injectors and fuel pumps and all that stuff. You know, the thing that collectors are going to have a hard time with the GTR 50 years from now is remembering all of the changes that happened every year. This has been a particularly, Nissan's been really iterative on this car in that every year there's been some pretty major changes, if I recall correctly. It may have been the same for 2 years and then changed dramatically after, but I seem to remember every year there being big changes. And you don't see that often in the car industry. You typically see a car launched, it's good for about 3 or 4 years, then there's a mid-cycle update, then another 3 or 4 years, and then a new generation. On this car, it's been boom, more power, better stopping power, more lateral capabilities, more comfort. Every year, bam, 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 bam. And that's a really cool thing to see, really interesting thing to see. This is the engine bay, I believe, of a later model because it has this carbon fiber brace around the side. Not a lot of room on the top of the engine for a actual shock tower brace or strut tower brace, so they've ran extra bracing around the side here, which is interesting. These bulges here, I believe, are the controllers for the variable intake valves. And what else? I mean, it's like 8-to-1 compression ratio. It's a strong motor, all aluminum. Instead of sleeves, the inside of the cylinder walls have a plasma coating. Typically, when you have an aluminum engine, you put iron sleeves in the bores to account for the stress and stuff to make it stronger. This doesn't have that because iron sleeves are apparently too heavy, so they did a plasma coating inside, and that's a technology you're seeing on a lot of cars these days. I believe the technology was actually pioneered and trademarked by Ford of all companies, I believe, but I could be wrong on that. Don't crucify me, Nissan GTR fans. But still really cool stuff. The engine, it's a short stroke, it's got a big bore, which is pretty typical stuff. A short stroke and a big bore basically means the engine is allowed to rev higher. If you had a long stroke and if your bore is smaller than your stroke, you typically have a lower red line, and that's kind of how you play around with where you want to deliver the power. Short stroke, big bore engines tend to make more RPM power than the other way around. And this has a red line about 7,000, but the power band is interesting because it's not. You'd expect it to be a turbo motor. You'd expect it to be some lag, especially because it's not, the bleeding edge modern turbo motor that we're seeing out of a lot of manufacturers these days. I mean, this is an older motor, as crazy that is to say, from 2009. But the power band is still really impressive because as soon as the turbos get on boost, and if you look at dyno graphs around the internet, you're looking at about, power coming in about 2,500 to 3,000 RPM, and there's a pretty linear build in power. It's drastically different than, say, like the new M3 or the, like some of the EcoBoost engines that Fords are doing, where they build really strong low range and then just sort of peter out the top end. This is still a top end motor, which is really cool because that makes for a really thrilling engine. M3 and M4 specifically, those seem to make a lot of torque initially and then just sort of stay there. And they're really interesting to drive because of that, but you kind of just like the feeling of top RPM power. That's a really nice thing. I mentioned it is a twin turbo engine, and a lot of automakers are you know, a lot of the Germans are putting turbos in between the valley right here now, but for the meantime, this is still has got turbos on the outside. Turbos in the valley is an interesting thing. It does raise the height of the engine. It does worsen it does raise the height of the center of gravity because you're working with stuff up here. But there apparently are a lot of dividends in turbo responsiveness and catalytic converter light off. The downside is you also are packing a lot of heat right in the head of the engine. But this engine is interesting because there's a lot of stuff happening here, a lot of stuff happening around the sides that it has to be really compact. And it's interesting how compact they've been able to make it with the front drivetrain stuff that we'll talk about later. You've got your intercoolers, your charge coolers, all the coolers and stuff in the front. And there's the full engine. Cool engine. It's I think the biggest complaint we make about this engine, and it's nice that it's the biggest complaint because that means nothing else is wrong, is the sound. It just doesn't really sound that nice. It doesn't have a nice, pleasing, like soulful sound. It's neither beautiful sounding like a Porsche or a Ferrari, or burly sounding like a Corvette or something. It's just sort of this. It seems like this artificially tuned effect that's unique. Don't get me wrong, it's unique. It's just not, I don't think, pleasant. And if that's the biggest complaint we can levy at this engine, like, cool, that's that's a good complaint. If that's your only complaint, if it's just the way it sounds, because everything else about this engine is pretty neat. I want to make sure I talked about all this stuff with the engine before we get into the rest of it, because there's a lot to get into with the rest. I will say the peak boost on earlier GTRs was around 12 psi, 13 psi, and later models have increased that. The interesting thing is the byproduct of that is the Nismo GTR, which I absolutely adore. It requires 93 octane, and if you run 91 octane, what happens? Well, it just limits boost. The NOx sensors notice that the octane rating is not desired, and it limits the boost to, I believe, 13 or 12 psi around there, and that gives you the standard GTR output, which I still believe is like 545 horsepower instead of 600, or maybe even higher than that. When we've tested the car in California, every time we've tested it, at Nissan's recommendation, we've used octane booster, and it's worked. The clever thing about the gauges that I can show you later in here is that you can actually just look at the boost level, and when you're running around and you're seeing it's not going all the way to 15 or 16 psi, it's hitting 12 or 13. You know you're not making peak boost, and whatever you're doing is not really worth it. It doesn't damage the motor per Nissan. It just is not going to give you the full amount of power. That's why they have NOx sensors, to avoid that kind of damage. It's nice that you have that option, and octane booster isn't terribly expensive. I saw a lot of comments on the YouTube videos that we've done, like saying, "Oh my God, I can't believe you put octane booster in that car. It's worthless. It's not going to do anything." Well, Nissan engineers recommended it, and the stuff that we used, you could tell when when it was making boost and when it was not. You could feel the lack of acceleration, and you could see the boost readout. And that's how that worked. I mean. But now we get into the rest of the car. Oh yeah, more of the front. We have some cutaway photos in here that I took from Nissan's press site. And there's a lot of complexity. They're the turbochargers themselves. These are not the Nismo turbochargers. These are the standard one, I believe. But as you can see from this, they're what's it called? They're integrated into the manifolds, the exhaust manifold. It's no longer a separate piece bolted on. This is all one unit. Which is, you're seeing a lot of people do that. A lot of automakers do that just because, there's less stuff between here and here, the quicker this stuff gets working. Oh, all these engines, of course. Oh, God, I can't believe I forgot about this. Every single what is it again? VR38DETT. Every single VR38DETT is assembled by hand in a special factory in Japan, in Nissan, by Takumis, which are experts. I forget the definition, but it has something to do with expert in process or something like that. And each engine has the name of the person who built it. That started recently. I think in the past few years. They didn't always have that. But it's a really cool thing to brag about with your Nissan, that every engine is hand-assembled. The process takes anywhere from 3 to 6 hours. I've checked a variety of sources, but couldn't really nail down the time. And I think the team is pretty small. I saw one page said it was like 4 people responsible for building every GTR engine. That's a pretty cool job when you think about it. And everything's put together by hand. I believe the transaxle and the rear diff is by hand too. There's a lot of by hand stuff on this car, which really adds to the specialness of the car. It's cool to be able to say that. I mean, not a lot of cars at $100,000 have hand assembled components. That's true for, oh god, if I were on the list, I forget off the top of my head, but it's a rarefied thing. I think the CLA 45 is like the cheapest one with hand assembled parts, but whatever, doesn't matter. It's a cool thing regardless, and there's your name on the plaque on the engine. Which is really cool. You can thank the name. You can thank the person if you can pronounce the name. That's the trick. Now, coming off the back of the engine, and what do we not have here? Well, we don't have a transmission. That's further back. And what's this guy right here? That's interesting. Well, we'll talk about that later. Here are the exhaust manifolds reaching back through the side, and I have some other cool pictures of the underside to show how much of this is hidden from the rest of the car. The cutaways are always interesting. You can always find little details. There's one piston there, another cylinder there, the flow of all that stuff. So here is where the real magic of the GTR comes into play. You don't have a transmission here. You have a transaxle, a rear-mounted transaxle, and your differentials right here. That's all integrated into one unit. So engine makes power, spins this drive shaft, which I believe is carbon fiber, powers here, spins the rear tires. Now this guy up here is another drive shaft or a prop shaft, depending on how you want to call it, that sends power back up to the front axle. That's right, so the engine has to make power, send it back, and then whatever the computers deem needs to go to the front goes back up to the front on this shaft right here. That's a really complex way of doing it, right? I mean, that's an incredibly complex way. Why would you just have the transmission here and just route the power up front instead of having this secondary drive shaft? Weight. Transmissions are heavy, and when you're making a front engine car, you have to consider balance, especially if it's a sports car. You want, ideally a slightly rear biased, if not 50-50 weight distribution. So you move the transmission to the rear to move the weight. The problem is now you have to get power to the front, so that's why you add that shaft, and that does raise the weight as a whole, but you have a better balance as a result. We've tested countless GTRs, and they're doing about 55% on the front, 45% on the rear, which is really good. You still have a lot of weight, but it's better balanced than it would be otherwise. And the nice thing is Nissan calls this a front midship because the majority of the engine is behind the front axle. You can actually just see the axle line there. The distortion of the photo where this was taken actually shows that this is a little bit more forward than it actually is in the car. But that's why you do that, and that's how they do this all-wheel drive system. And the interesting thing is this is the only front-engine, rear transaxle, all-wheel drive car in the world. This is the only car that has ever done this, any production car that does this. And I believe that still holds true. I don't know anybody else I can't think of anybody else that does this with this power, this path of power to the front, to the rear, to the front again. It's bizarre when you get underneath the car and see it and you go, oh my god, this is crazy. But you can see why the decision was made to do this. It's because it's a better balance, and because ultimately this thing needs to be a balanced sports car that accomplishes everything. And the real trick of this all-wheel drive system is that it can bias the power as needed. Ideally, all performance cars, or maybe we should just not jump into that stuff yet. Maybe we should talk more about the transmission before we talk about the application and the theory. So this is the transmission. The name is, it's like GR6 or something like that. 6-speed dual clutch transmission. One of the earlier dual clutch transmissions on the market, and just has incredible shift times and stuff as a result. Here's the transmission itself. Here's the power in from the engine, and there's the power out to the front axle. Here's all the dual clutch stuff happening inside. If you understand transmissions, you must be a magician, because they're just like a black heart to me. I mean, you can watch a video on YouTube and get, in theory, how they work, but then you see this and you just go, huh? So here's the transmission, 6-speed dual clutch. Essentially, you have a clutch for gears 1, 3, and 5, and another clutch for gears 2 and 6. If you already know this, just plug your ears. When you're in first gear, second gear is already preloaded. So when you grab the upshift, you're already in that gear. There's no hesitation. And this is still a solid transmission. More newer twin clutches are a bit faster, have a bit less clunk to them, but this one still works very, very well and can handle absurd amounts of power from what we're seeing out of some tuner companies. And then here's the differential. The rear differential is an electronically controlled locking differential, and the front is open. And so the computer is going to control rear lockup and power to the front, and that's how that all comes together. So the dampers are from Bilstein. I think they're called Damptronic or something, and they are adjustable. They continually monitor the road and make adjustments very quickly to compensate for them. And then you can also select between 3 modes inside the car to get the ideal scenario, whether that's normal, race for stiff, or comfort, which is slightly comfortable. It's all relative in the world of sports cars. This is the front, and you can tell why because of this massive split fork here, because this has to make way for the axle off the front differential, basically. And this is the rear. It doesn't have to deal with that because of the way it's mounted. And as you can see here, I believe this is the front. It's a very complex space when you're working with an all-wheel drive car because you have to control, especially on the front end, because you have to put your damper there. You have to do the suspension components, your control arms, your anti-roll bar, all your links. You have to do steering, and now you have to do an axle sending power. So there's a lot of space. There's not a lot of space in the end, but there's a lot of things you have to get going to attach the wheel and the brake to the car itself, and you start losing room real quick when you do all-wheel drive cars. It's one of the reasons all-wheel drive cars aren't really desirable. It's because of the complexity required at the front end. And as you can see here, this is the front axle. Big, huge brakes, your control arm, your anti-roll bar, your steering right here, your axle right there, same side, and everything's gonna have to fight for space. It's nice when you're a R&D car company because you can make all this stuff work because you have millions at your disposal to line all this stuff up. But as you can imagine, any backyard guy trying to do this without CAD and engineers and millions of dollars and research funds at your disposal would have a very difficult time because there's a lot of stuff fighting for the same space. And at the rear axle, it's similar but less complex because the rear doesn't have to steer. You have your center differential, or not center, your rear differential goes here, axles go out, dampers up there. This is a multi-link. There's a couple links that aren't shown here for the sake of just cleanliness. And here it is. Here's a cutaway of it all together. And I don't know what year specifically this one's taken from, but yeah, you can just see all the stuff needed to attach attach the wheel to the car itself. Brakes are from Brembo. They've always been from Brembo, and they have to work with a lot of heat. They have to manage a ton of heat because the GTR is a heavy car. There's no getting around it. 3,700 to 3,800 to almost nearly 3,900 pounds in our findings, and that's just because of all the stuff it has to work with. There's a 600, 700 pound engine that's fully dressed. There's on the rear axle there's the transaxle and the locking differential, and then at the front there's more power going around there. It's still a primarily steel chassis too. Like it's high strength and lightweight steel, but it's still steel. Whereas we're seeing a lot of modern performance cars come out, a lot of new performance cars come out using all aluminum, if not carbon fiber. I'd be surprised if the next GTR, if there is a next GTR, and there sure will be one, the next GTR will probably have a lot of carbon fiber, if not be all aluminum. That's just where the technology is going. But for the time being, it's still steel, and that means it's heavy. And that's what you get. So a lot of heat has to be controlled by the Brembo brakes, and they do a pretty spectacular job considering GTR isn't a car that we experience a lot of overheating, a lot of tire wear, or a lot of brake wear, and that's really a really impressive feat. we like to talk a lot about lap times and acceleration and braking results, but we don't often talk about longevity because, let's face it, it's not as sexy. But for owners, it might be. And honestly, I haven't looked into a lot of the GTR owners, but I can say from my perspective as somebody who tests these cars a lot, they hold up really well during testing. We don't get brake fluid overheating. We don't get tires falling apart. We don't get engines overheating. Like, that's something I can't say about a lot of other sports cars. And we test them harder than most customers use them. And there sure are a small number of customers who drive them just as hard, if not harder than us. But we experience a lot of issues testing cars. That's just part of it. But GTR is one of those cars that just always is bulletproof. Which is really cool. That's a really impressive thing to say about a car. Again, it's not a sexier thing to say, but it is an impressive thing. The Dunlops they have on them, they have some, oh God, they just have a horrifically complex name. Dunlop Sport Max DSST CTT or something like that. I've almost memorized it because I've written it down so many times. But they have a ton of life. It's amazing. We get to some of the Pirellis or the Continentals on other sports cars, and they're done after a lapping session with Randy at the wheel. Now, that's with Randy at the wheel. That's not with me at the wheel. That's not with your typical driver at the wheel. That's with Randy at the wheel going at race pace. So you expect accelerated durability issues. But Dunlops, these Dunlops in particular, hold up extremely well. We do not see wear out of these things like we do other tires. They hold up impressively well. And speaking of horrifically long names, one thing I forgot to mention was the transmissions, or the all-wheel drive system's name. It is ATTESA-ETS Pro. And that stands for, I had to write it down, it stands for Advanced Total Traction Engineering System for all-terrain with electric torque split. Is that a nightmare or what? ATTESA-ETS Pro. God. So getting to the undertrain of the airflow of the car, you really start to appreciate these cars when you get underneath them and when you can start poking around at all their interesting bits. So I'm glad this photo exists. It's basically a flat undertray, and that's how you massage airflow. A lot of people have the wrong impression that the GTR is kind of like the aerodynamic equivalent of a brick. It's not. Nissan claims it has a coefficient of drag of 0.27, which is really good as a loose, term of aerodynamics. It's a slippery car. It does not have a lot of drag, and the Nismo cars, I believe, actually create downforce too, while still having a very similar coefficient of drag. And you get that through carefully massaging airflow underneath the car. If you look, this is entirely flat, and the exhaust is open, presumably so it can cool off. The Nismo version, which we'll get to later, or Nismo, or however you want to pronounce it, has some interesting ducting around the brakes too, to help move airflow around. It's really cool stuff under here. If you ever get a GTR on a lift, just walk for a few minutes underneath it, and just look around, and there'll be details everywhere that are interesting. It's carbon fiber for crying out loud. It's interesting. A lot of automakers show off carbon fiber everywhere. Carbon fiber splitter, carbon fiber dash, carbon fiber, and then Nissan, all the carbon fiber bits are the stuff you can't see. Like, no one's going to stick their head underneath the car unless it's on a lift to see that the undertray is carbon fiber. Like, that's incredible. And it's cool, too. And the interesting thing on the Nismo, too, here's the Nismo exhaust. You can get a titanium exhaust system on the Nismo, and it's like a $12,000 option, and it's gorgeous. It is absolutely beautiful. When I got underneath there, I was like blown away by the colors and the weld, and it's amazing stuff. These are heat fins. They're made to dispatch heat. Heat goes up and sort of, if you've seen a heat sink on a CPU, a very similar concept here, and more along the side. But when you get underneath the Nismo that has a titanium exhaust, the only way you see it is from underneath it. If you're behind the car, if you're on the side, there's no tells that you have a titanium exhaust. It's pretty funny how hidden it is. You kind of wonder how it happened, because any other automaker would be bragging about it all over the place. It'd have titanium exhaust tips, and there'd be some cutaways in the rear just to show the titanium-ness, all the colors that you get out of titanium. There's NACA ducts in the Nismo. There's NACA ducts everywhere underneath just to control airflow. Here's one of the brake cooling fins that I mentioned earlier that helps manage airflow. It's just really cool stuff underneath. The inside is pretty straightforward. The tack is centered and dominant, and as any good sports car. What's nice is, this speedo is kind of useless because of how big the jumps are. This is also kilometers per hour, but you have a nice digital speedo here when you're driving, which is really helpful, and your gear selector's up here when you're cruising along. Wow, that's a really small picture. So these are the toggle switches. You've of course probably already seen this stuff to choose all your different settings. That's how you get your stability off, your traction off, all that. We found these cars, especially the track editions and the Nismo editions, are so nicely balanced that you could just run them traction off all day. As long as you treat them with respect, they are so nicely balanced that you don't have to worry about power oversteer. These cars just solve it. They work so well. And then they have the infotainment stuff, the polyphony digital built systems, which is really cool. All modern cars pull this information and analyze it inside the car's brain. Like, all the information's already there. And what's cool is more and more you're seeing cars that just show the driver, give the passengers access to that information for no other reason than that it's cool to look at. When you're driving a GTR hard, this stuff is pointless. Like, you're not going to look over that and monitor your Excel G or your boost pressure. But it just looks cool to other people in the car, or it just looks cool when you're cruising around slowly. It's purely theater. If you could log it, there might be advantages there, and I believe you can with a GTR. But it's just theater, and that's cool. Like, this is all cool stuff to see and show off to your buddies when you're cruising along. Like, it's just neat. So that's where we get to the part where it all comes together. And my theory on why the GTR works as well as it does, it's not because it cheats physics. That was the big refrain when the car first came out. It doesn't cheat physics, it just uses them appropriately. So, what's the best way to approach this? You figure your tire wants to basically do one thing. Your given tire, on the front of the rear wants to do one thing. It either wants to accelerate, it wants to brake, it wants to turn, and that's it. The more you ask of it, the less it can do those things. It can't brake as hard as it can turn. So ideally, when there's a lot of driving instructors who talk about smoothing out your transitions into corners from your braking to your turning, because you ideally want to drive the car and make the tire only do one thing at a time, and do the handoff from braking to turning to acceleration as smoothly as possible to not upset the car and to make sure the tires are always working at their peak, but doing as much as they can, doing whatever you can ask of them. Now, the problem with all-wheel drive cars, and generally all-wheel drive is bad for sports cars across the board. There are exceptions. The GTR is the biggest exception. Evo is another one. STI to a lesser extent. The 911s and the S4 with the torque vectoring system. Those are pretty much the exceptions. Everything else is not ideal for performance driving. Why? Well, because you're asking the front tires to do more, and they're already consumed. The front tires are responsible for the majority of your braking and your turning, right? Why do you want to make them accelerate the car too? That's how you can get some really undesirable handling traits if you're simultaneously having to power the car while turning. Imagine like a steady state skid pad where you're responsible for making the car turn as hard as you can, right? So if I'm in a skid pad, 200 foot, 300 foot, whatever, I'm on a steady state, I'm trying to get like a G out of the car, I'm cornering, and I'm really up at the limits of adhesion for these tires. If I have to ask for throttle, like to accelerate out, and I exceed the tire's traction capabilities, I've lost traction up front, I start understeering off course. That's bad. That's not what you want. That's why every good sports car is front engine, rear drive, because the rear tires, they don't have to cope with turning. They just have to submit to lateral loads that the front end's doing the majority of, but there's still something happening on the rear. And when you apply power, they can help drive out because they have to do less of the work. Of course, the byproduct is really fun. It's called oversteer, and that's manageable and controllable, whereas understeer is just a mess. That's why all-wheel drive, uncontrolled all-wheel drive, when it's just locked split, is not ideal. Because you're numbing your steering feel, you're inducing understeer into the car, and you're making the car heavier, and you're making the front suspension harder to make because you're as I mentioned, you're making that space complex. Why the GTR works is because of that horrifically named all-wheel drive system. The majority of the time, the GTR is rear drive. It's sending like 2% of torque to the front, and that's probably because that drivetrain, the drive shaft always has to be turning. They can't just decouple it completely. But the majority of the time, a Nissan GTR is rear drive. And you can verify that if you get in one by looking at the torque split while driving in a straight line. It's always at the rear. It can go 50-50, but it doesn't that often. Ideally, it's always rear drive. In fact, we've tested a lot of GTRs, a lot of stock ones, and I tested a 1200 horsepower AMS, like just insane machine with like a 9-second quarter mile. And the AMS guys told me that when you're launching that car, if the rear tires spin too much and the front starts to apply traction, if the rear tires spin too much and the all-wheel drive system reacts by sending more power to the front, you're already going slower than if you could have just launched with all the torque in the rear. That goes to show that, like, hey, when this kind of speed, like, all-wheel drive is not really the right solution for this system. But they wanted it to launch rear-wheel drive as much as possible because the time it takes to send that power to the front, get that to hook up, and the time lost in having the rear tires spin hurts the run. And when you're doing a quarter mile in 9 seconds, you don't have a lot of time to work with. So that goes to show, ideally, you're always rear drive. The clever thing about this system, though, is that it can selectively send torque to the front axle, and it does that in really interesting ways, and enables really interesting handling tendencies. So what the car is going to do is it looks at a ton of sensors. I had to write down all the sensors. Speed, steering, tire slip, yaw rate, lateral and transverse acceleration, like loads, like G loads, and it can bias power to the front axle when it thinks the car needs it. So imagine you're coming out of a corner, and out of that corner you're applying throttle and you're steering out of the corner. As you're steering out of the corner, you're reducing the workload on the front tires, and you're not braking either, so the tires are just doing less work. Why don't you just start applying some power to them then? If you can apply power in a way that doesn't overwhelm the tires as you're coming out of a corner, you can accelerate harder, because if you have a ton of power like the GTR does, you might consume the rear end and get oversteer on power. But if you can send power to the front, it'll help you pull out of the corner. So like in like a mega powerful rear drive car coming out of a corner, you're going to apply gas, you're going to have to modulate throttle because you want to make sure you don't get all sideways coming out of the corner, because that's slow. But with a GTR, coming out of a corner, you can apply gas as hard as you want. The rear tires may start to slip, may start to oversteer, but then the front axle gets power and starts sending you out. That's what makes the car so fast. It's not magic. It's just a clever all-wheel drive system and a locking rear diff, like in a computer control that's a computer system that gives really good control over the car. It just gets you out of corners faster. If I had to, I've mentioned this before in videos, that if I had to boil down what makes the GTR work so well is its traction and its torque. It has relatively short gearing. This thing will only do 195, but it really starts to peter out in terms of acceleration. At least the early models did. The ones with 600 horsepower, or the Nismo with 600 horsepower works. I mean, still accelerates fantastically well. The what's it called, the standard models, the 480 horse to 530 to 545 horsepower models, they stop accelerating aggressively at about 100 miles an hour. And you think, the acceleration's still there, it's just not as heavy as it is beneath 100. They start running into longer gearing issues, they start running into power fall off issues. But that 100 mile an hour acceleration result is good, because most racetracks, you're not doing over 100 for extended periods of time. There are exceptions like VIR, like the big track at Willow Springs, but a lot of racetracks are under 100 miles an hour. And so if you can deliver that acceleration that quickly out of a corner, you have what makes the car work so well, and that's really the secret. And then the rest is all in, calibrating the suspension and tuning everything else to make the drive pleasant. And that's what Nissan's done. Like, this is a really good handling car. Every time it's come to Best Driver's Car, and I think it's been a Best Driver's Car every year for the past, we've been doing it, I forget how many years we've been doing it now. We've been doing it since 2008 or 2009. The first year it came out, I mean, it's been top 3 like every year. And that kind of consistency is really impressive, and the GTR is a hell of a car. And I kind of come back and forth between lukewarm to passionate and back and forth. But the latest one, this Nismo one, is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, the price has jumped quite a bit. When the GTR first came out, it was $78,000, and now the Nismo is like $150 or $160. But the people who are going to get this Nismo, I'm envious, because it's a fantastic car. It's an absolutely fantastic car. I absolutely adore this car. They've made the changes on this car are pretty subtle. Bodywork's all different, or at least the bumpers and the side sills are different, and that's all motorsports derived airflow stuff, and so is the wing too. It's a lot of it is the bushings in the front end, new damper calibrations and all that stuff give the front end a tenacity when you turn in. You can be really aggressive with this car, and there's like zero perceivable understeer with this car, no matter how fast you enter the corner. Well, if you enter too fast, of course, you'll always get understeer. But it's a really incredibly balanced machine. Just absolutely fantastic. Of course, I threw this in because this is how GTRs normally look. Just have crowds of people around them. But what else? Let me make sure I didn't miss anything. The real trick when it comes to driving the GTR, and that we've noticed time and time again, is that the way the all-wheel drive system works, it's not like computers cheating, it's not science breaking, but it makes the GTR a really easy car to drive quickly, and that's the primary trait of this car, besides the speed, is the ease of use. And sometimes people instantly take that as an insult, and it's not by any means. It's a compliment more than anything else. You never meet a race car driver who wants a car that's hard to drive fast. That's hard work. You want to enjoy the experience. That's why you're out there driving these cars. And when it comes to a car that you can get into and instantly, if not near instantly, like if you can see where you can make the car faster, if you can feel that out almost instinctively, that's a good car. And it's especially true for the world of what we do. We have to set lap times quickly and move on to the next one and set lap times quickly. We don't have a lot of time to grow and appreciate the cars. But as a whole, what I like about this car, and what I also like about cars like the 911 and the new Corvette, the Z51, is that once you get in and once you start driving them hard, you can instantly feel out the limits. There's no a car doesn't surprise you, it doesn't unsettle you. It's stuff that's just almost encouraging you to drive faster and faster, and that's the fundamentals of what makes a good driving car. When we take this car to a racetrack to do comparisons, head-to-heads, and track data, Randy Popes goes out, he does 3 or 4 laps, brings it in, and that's the lap, that's it. Where other cars, that are more sensitive, that are more have more quirks and stuff, you're looking like 2 or 3 lap sessions, playing with tire pressures, playing with stability control settings, playing with this and that to get the best lap time. The GTR just does it, and it comes in. You don't have to change tires. You don't have to play with all that stuff. It just works. And I think about, like, if I was going to a track day, I don't want to spend time in the pits, like tinkering around stuff. I want to drive. And that's what's really cool. As an owner of this car, you could conceivably just drive to a track day with a folding chair and tire pressure gauge, and that's all you'd really need, which is really neat. And you could drive home, and you could drive to work the next day. Cars that do that, cars that are multidisciplined, we tend to find to be the most impressive. The single, use cars are really cool too. That's why we love the Camaro Z28. If you can really nail that single use, that's a really cool thing too. But the multi-discipline cars really are the ones that get us, because it's a car that doesn't make compromises to do other things. Like, yeah, this car it is loud inside. It is, the drivetrain makes clunking noises everywhere, but it is an absolutely impressive machine. There's nothing like it in the sports car world. It sits up high. It makes funny noises. The complexity of the drivetrain is out there. But in terms of fun to drive, and in terms of just being different, this is really where it's at. I think that might do it. Apologies if this was a little light. I haven't. What I like to do with these episodes is really spend a lot of time with a car, talk to the engineers, do a lot of research and inspect newer stuff, and I just haven't been able to do any of that lately. All the cars that I kind of want to do are still coming out, and there will be more of episodes like this year, hopefully with a bit more info and hopefully with a bit more insight. What I don't want to do with this is let's get back here. What I don't want to do with the Let's Geek Out series is just rehash press releases and show press photos and just give you information that you could find anywhere else. What I like to do is give you some more insight from my own experiences and my own take on the way they work. So that means I can't do cars that I haven't driven, and I can't do cars that I also haven't done a lot of research into. The GTR is a special beast because I have spent a lot of time with it. It's changed and grown throughout my own career, and it's been really fascinating to watch, to come into this industry when this car was new and see how it blew away people in the industry, and to mature with it, see how it matured as I matured in this job. It's been really cool to see. So this car will always hold a special place for me, for being how different it is, how incredibly capable it is, and how solid it is. And I can't wait to see the next one. As always, if you have any questions, comments, if you want to tell me I got something wrong, and I'm sure I got something wrong, do so in the comments section. And hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you next time.